waterfall, fast-flowing river, and so forth. And then, of course, in the second half of the retreat, the main practice has been the Vipashyana practice, insight practice, and of course here we are applying mindfulness. So in Shamatha practice, we're cultivating mindfulness, we're strengthening mindfulness. Vipashyana, then we're applying that mindfulness. And we saw there that the classic approach at the foundation level for that is these 4 applications of mindfulness. To apply mindfulness to the body, feelings, mind, phenomena, to come to these 3 insights of impermanence, suffering, no self. And so we saw there that this insight into impermanence is very helpful for many reasons. One, of course, directly is then we'll be more working with the flow of life than fighting against the flow of life by having attachment to pleasant, aversion to unpleasant. So that will help to reduce mental afflictions, and also that insight into impermanence really serves as a basis for the other insights as well. The insight into suffering, of course, is going to be very helpful to help us to turn our mind inward, to look within ourselves for the source of happiness and suffering instead of out there. And then, of course, the insight into no self to really help to reduce, eliminate mental afflictions and suffering. And then we saw that in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, we take that to another step, this insight into emptiness, to come to realize there is no independent me, no independent objective world, that everything is interdependent. And we saw there that to begin that practice, then it's very much recommended to focus on me, the person. Where is this me that seems to be here? And today we use a slightly alternate approach, of course, the one we see particularly in the Mahamudra and Dzogchen traditions in Tibetan Buddhism. Instead of focusing on me, the person, focusing on the mind, on awareness. Where is this awareness? Where is this mind that seems to be here? So, of course, we can use either of those approaches, the one that we resonate most with, and then we can really start to have that little taste of emptiness, and of course, through that will really help to, again, reduce mental afflictions, that false grasping. Also, it will help to improve, to support the loving kindness and compassion practices as well, of course. And we saw there briefly yesterday that this 5-stage model, this 5 paths model of how to progress in this practice from simply intellectual understanding through to having a taste and experience, through to realization, through to direct realization, and then how to move along the path using that. And then, of course, the other third main element that we focused on in this retreat is the compassion wing of practice. That compassion wing can really help balance not only the Vipashyana but the Shamatha as well. And of course, the compassion wing of practice also gives us the healthy direction in our practice. And so there we saw that we're cultivating these 4 qualities: loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity. That, again, loving kindness and compassion are really focusing on the same thing, but from 2 perspectives. Loving kindness from the perspective of genuine happiness, and compassion from the perspective of freedom from suffering. And we're cultivating, of course, these qualities in stages, starting with ourselves first, moving out to friends, to strangers, difficult people, and toward everyone. And we saw there that empathetic joy is very important, particularly for us in the modern world, because we have this obsessive focus on the negative. So we need to really get that balance by focusing on the positives of ourselves and others as well. And that empathetic joy enables us to do that. And then, of course, that equanimity that really helps us to be able to expand those qualities out to all living beings. And then also in this retreat, of course, we then built on those 4 immeasurables in terms of this exchanging self with others to really help us to overcome this selfish, self-cherishing attitude, which is quite strong in the modern world, to really replace that with the mind of cherishing others, to really transform our normal attachment and aversion into loving kindness and compassion. And we saw there that the meditation practice of Tonglen, giving and taking, can be a very powerful practice to enable us to do that. In fact, that Tonglen practice also really covers these four immeasurables very well. So if you were to just do one practice from the compassion wing, that would be a very good practice to do, the Tonglen practice. And we saw there that not only, of course, we have that meditative practice of Tonglen, but we can be doing this Tonglen exercise throughout the day, whenever we see suffering in others and ourselves. So these were the three main practices we engaged in this retreat. And we saw also a little bit earlier today, but also earlier than that as well, is that to really effectively move forward, then we need to cover these bases, either the four bases or these three main practices, because also these three main practices will also cover the motivational balance that we described separately there this afternoon. So I think if we really want to be effective in developing ourselves, in reducing our mental afflictions and increasing our positive qualities, then we need to cover these three bases, that the Shamatha practice to really cultivate that calm, clear, focused mind, and on that basis to engage in these two wings of practice of wisdom and compassion, to develop the positive qualities and to really work on overcoming our distorted view, this grasping, to really then start to overcome mental afflictions and suffering. So we'll talk a little bit more tomorrow morning about how to sort of package that up a little bit more in daily life, but maybe that's all I wanted to mention now, and have a little bit of time for some question answer, either on what I've just talked about or the Vipashyana practice that we've been doing today.
When we just meditated now, and it happens to me, this dullness. Yeah,
Dullness.
Yeah, I feel my eyes are getting closed. So, okay, I take the gaze up, I'm looking at the ceiling. Yeah,
Well, that's maybe
yeah, but still they are shutting down.
No.
So, I know, okay, so then I did sleep enough, and I don't know, I ate too much, but okay. but then I asked myself, should I better close my eyes, because then the issue with the eyes is the awareness changes, but because sometimes it is frustrating, this dullness.
Sure. So again, the points I mentioned, so I won't bother going through them again. But this is something we can then experiment with at home. Particularly, often people find it a bit difficult with the eyes open. But then I'd experiment at home. For me personally, I prefer to meditate in a completely dark room. I don't have... My more problem is agitation and dullness. So for me, I like completely dark room. So you might like to experiment with that. And then again, the eyes, personally I like to have them just naturally open, but other people prefer to have them hooded, what's called hooded. So you can experiment with that as well. And of course, we're not trying to don't strain the eyes, blink as often as you need, don't try to deliberately unfocus. So I think just experiment a little bit, and of course keep the session short. Again, don't meditate after every meal. And in fact, what can be very helpful, of course, if we're meditating in the morning, then hopefully we're doing the practice before breakfast and not after breakfast. So then hopefully then the food is not going to be an issue in the morning practice. And generally, that's usually the best time to meditate for most people, because again, we're most fresh, alert, it's most quiet, and a good way to start the day. But also, different people have different sort of biorhythms and so forth. I mean, as a generalization, people often are having their sinking sort of early afternoon. So then if we can schedule the meditation then for the time of day, then just see when we as an individual are most alert in the day and schedule the shamatha there. For example, for me, if I'm doing a retreat and then I can schedule these various different practices at different times of day, actually for me as a generalization, I find I'm most alert late afternoon, early evening. So then I do a lot of shamatha then. And then when I'm a little bit more sinking, I do more active meditations, the Glen, the Vipashyana practices. So then you can also do like that.
I remember you said that before our meeting with our people, that before I meet someone who's probably going to bring some affection in me.
Oh, some reaction in you?
Yeah, I should do
Well, you can do it, yeah.
Which I thought is a really nice idea. So my question is, I mean, the first one is, the open question is, do you have any more recommendation like that? But more specifically, one, for example, for important, like not people, but for example, tomorrow when I get my phone, I'm probably going to get a very important grade for school. So my question is there something I can do to better deal with that? Obviously, Glen is not the approach.
But again, I think it's the similar idea is that if we have too much focus on ourselves, then we react. So the Glen is helping us to shift the focus on others. So if we're a difficult person, focus on them. But for like something like that, some sort of results, exam results, we can think about, well, I'm doing this so that I can be more effective in, maybe I can get a better job, I can help people more. So again, shift the focus out, away from ourselves, and I think that can be very helpful, to have a really expansive motivation on that. That really does help a lot.
Two questions. One about resting in awareness. I just want to make things clear for myself. How you said in the early days that when resting in awareness it's like doing nothing. Yeah, it's kind of.
Well, it's close to doing nothing.
And then I find that doing nothing is, I don't know, it's elusive in a way.
Yeah, of course, because we always want to do something.
No, but I mean.
The only time we do nothing is when we fall asleep.
I mean, how would you recommend me enter this awareness? Because I feel that I can't not see, I cannot hear, and that's doing it in a sense.
Right, but here again, it's not about trying to block that, but it's a matter of just releasing it. Keep releasing it, keep releasing. Because we will. I mean, when we rest in awareness, some sound comes, we'll go.
Yeah.
Some thought comes, we'll go, of course. I mean, that's our habit. So not to get frustrated and try and block that, but just when it happens, just keep releasing, keep releasing, keep releasing. Just keep letting that go, let it go, let it go, let it go. And you'll find that if you just keep doing that, and of course, to be okay that happens. Because if we're not okay, we're going to get frustrated.
Yeah.
And then it's just going to it's like throwing petrol on the fire. So to be completely okay that this is going to happen. It will happen, in fact.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And just when it does, not if, when it happens, just keep releasing, keep letting it go, keep letting it go, keep letting it go. And the more you do that, then over time, of course, that habit of following will get weaker and weaker. And that's great, that's good.
And my other question is more related to what...
And also, just another point on that is, again, if we can keep the awareness as expansive as possible, instead of like this, that's why the relaxation. In this practice, relaxation is key. The harder we try, the more difficult it gets. So if you can keep that mind awareness as expansive as possible, and you can do that merging mind with space as a sort of prelude to really open it up, you'll find that if you're like that, and one of these things comes up, it's easier to just stay there. If you're like this, and something comes, so really try that.
The other question is, now that you made this overview, I realize how many I learned here, like 20 different kinds of meditations and things to do and things to notice, things to be aware of.
Where do I start?
Yeah, how to start? I mean,
Tomorrow morning.
tomorrow.
But the short answer is I've tried to, in this retreat, give the sort of the big picture. Because then we can see where we are, what's available, and where we can go. I mean, we're not going to try and do, of course, all of this at the same time. I mean, the same as if you're doing a multi-year study program, they lay it out for you at the beginning and say, these are all the things we're going to do. We're not trying to do them all in year one, are we? We do them in a step-by-step way as it's laid out. And so similarly here, we've got a lot of stuff here laid out in a fairly systematic way, and so then we can sort of step through it. And we're going to look a little bit more about where we can begin now, but also I think the other thing that's going to be very helpful is if we really want to work within the system fully and over time, then it's helpful to have a qualified teacher, because it's a little bit like, you know, if you're doing a big study program, if you have your personal tutor, they can help a lot, save a lot of time. So therefore, that's another recommendation, is to, if you know, I mean, if you only do want a little bit of meditation each day, and okay, then that's okay. You don't need a highly qualified person for that. But if you really want to try to work with a lot of these things in a sort of a significant way, then that can be very, very helpful, because the qualified teacher can then really tailor all of this stuff according to where you are and your personality and what's going to help you most, and it'll save a lot of time. It'll save a lot of time.
I just wanted to say that until today I had a lot of problems with the awareness meditation. And today, when you ask how big is the awareness, suddenly I understood. Before I was looking for it all the time here, you know.
Yeah, good. Very good. I mean,
About the qualified teacher, where can we find something like that? What is qualified teacher? What do you mean by that?
yeah, well, there's a lot to say on that, but maybe a brief answer. First, of course, is that from our side, you know, they talk about being a qualified student. And so part of that, of course, is that we need to be putting effort into these things. You know, that we're sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? We're enthusiastic to do this, and not just sort of like, you know, where's the teacher sort of thing. So otherwise you're going to be wasting their time and your time if you're not really wanting to implement these ideas. So, I mean, generally, if you go to a teacher for advice, if you're not willing to follow the advice, then don't waste their time. You know? But anyways, there's a lot more to be said on that. But I think the first step is to find a tradition that resonates with you, because there's no point if you like some sort of Tibetan Buddhist stuff and you find a teacher that's following the Thai tradition. I mean, that's not really going to work very well. And even in Tibetan Buddhism, of course, we saw the 4 schools, and they're quite different in the way they approach things. I mean, they're all talking about bodhicitta and emptiness and so forth, but how they approach things is quite different. So, you know, if you are drawn to like Tibetan Buddhism, then which one of those 4 approaches resonates with you the most? And then find a teacher within that tradition, because you have to be on the same page as the teacher in terms of what sort of approach you would do in practice. And of course, with that teacher, how to relate to them, I use the analogy of a fire. If you're too close to a fire, you get burnt. If you're too far, you don't receive any warmth. Similarly, if you're too close to the teacher, you can get burnt. And if you're too far, you don't receive any inspiration or guidance. What do we mean by getting burnt? We can get burnt in at least two ways. One is, if we're too close to the teacher, there can be this habit of absolving responsibility. Anytime I have a question, I ask the teacher. That's not in our best interest, because we'll never develop as a person, we'll become codependent on them. In fact, if we have a teacher and they see that we're sort of doing that a little bit, they're often very harsh on us, very tough on us, and say, sort it out yourself, that's trivial. And the other thing that we can get burnt with is if we're too close to the teacher, seeing them all the time, we often project a lot of faults onto the teacher which are often not there. So to have that distance where you can receive inspiration, but you don't get burnt. And so therefore the teacher doesn't even have to be living in your local area. But it would be helpful to be able to physically see that teacher at least 2 or 3 times a year to get advice, because what normal procedure is, the teacher would give you some advice and you'd go away and implement that, and maybe some weeks or months later you come back and say, well, this is what happened, and then based on your response they'd say, okay, continue with that, or they'd say, okay, now change this a little bit and do this, go away and do it. And so there'd be this sort of feedback thing happening. And then, of course, in the modern world now, maybe they say go away and do something, but then after a week or two you've come up with an obstacle or something you're unsure of, then, of course, these days you can email and you just say, oh, this has come up, what do you think? What do you recommend? So you can still have that little bit of access if something comes up, but other than that, I think we need to make sure that they're not doing everything for us. Because actually, if we want to call the teacher the sort of the guru, then the job of the outer guru is to awaken the inner guru within ourselves. So you should find that over time you're becoming more and more self-reliant on your own inner wisdom. So they're there just to hold your hand until that develops. So that's sort of the perspective that we should have, that they're there to help us to awaken the inner guru within ourselves.
Okay, and then thank you. The next question is, if I'm suffering like physically or mentally, like headache or something, to do Glen just for others or for me and then others?
Well, of course, if you can resolve it by, we're not sitting there, let's just suffer. I mean, if you can...
Glen is like
yeah, but I mean, if you
have
some physical suffering or something and you can take some medication or do something to resolve it, we just resolve it, of course. We don't just sit there and wallow in suffering. But if that's not the case, then of course we can just do the Tong... I mean, we can do the Tonglen for ourselves, of course, which would be like a reverse Tonglen. It's more like a purification, where you can do like, imagine the suffering in some sort of form, and then you can imagine sort of the light sort of dispelling that. So that's like a lot of purification. So that can be very helpful. But in addition to that, then we can do, again, the example I gave, that take everyone's suffering and give them happiness. Because then we're not sort of caught up in our own suffering and going like this, and we're using that situation to develop loving kindness and compassion for others. So I think we can do both of those things.
Reverse, I thought to throw it on others.
Sorry?
Reverse, Dominic.
No.
I don't know, maybe it's premature, but I was just thinking about how do you recommend to divide the time between the Vipassana and the Shamatha?
Yeah. A little bit more tomorrow morning, but a brief answer, and then it's time for dinner. And that is that I think that balance will depend a little bit on where we're at, and that balance will probably shift from one week to the next or one day to the next. But again, as a generalization, what we've seen here and in general is that if our attention skills are very poorly developed, as a beginner it would be helpful to emphasize the shamatha, but not only do shamatha. That's a little bit imbalanced. So rather, maybe we could have as our daily meditation practice shamatha. And then, but we would want to be adding from time to time some compassion, some Glen, for example, and some of the Vipashyana, the impermanence or the emptiness or nature of mind or so forth, to add those in from time to time. So some mornings you may just have a complete session of shamatha. Well, let's say, for example, you're doing maybe even 30 minutes, but we can't sustain that, so we break it into 2 15-minute sessions in the morning. Then the first half can be shamatha, and then the second half can be, on some days, shamatha again, so you have 2, or on other days it can be compassion, on other days it can be the Vipashyana. And then those, how we balance that, we can be flexible, and depending on what's going on. If we find that we're really lacking compassion at the moment, add more of that. If we find that we're doing a lot of grasping and mental afflictions and so forth, add more Vipashyana to release that. So that we can adjust according to what's going on in our life. So we can be quite flexible with that. And of course, if you're doing, if you're doing 2 meditation sessions a day, then again, generally, probably the shamatha in the morning is best. In the evening, where we're maybe a little bit more tired, to do something more active like Vipashyana or compassion in the evening. So that would be, if we're doing 2 a day, to have it like that, then we can have the balance for the day.
The other small question is, I've read in Alan Wallace's book about the stages of Shamatha, and he says that, I don't know if it's the 5th or 6th stage, or I don't remember, but that the breath becomes a mental object.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, because, I mean, maybe I've tasted a little bit of that. I mean, it was with my eyes closed, and I don't understand how it can be with your eyes open.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, maybe brief, and then we need dinner, I think. If we're using the breath as the object, so the object is the sensations, tactile sensations, as we're moving along that path, due to our improved stability, clarity, then at some point, what will happen, and it's spontaneous, it's not something we generate, we'll have what's called the acquired sign appearing. And the acquired sign is a mental image relating to the air element, to the breath. And how that appears will be very different depending on the person. But and it's not something you see with the eyes, it's a mental image. It could be a light, a star, or it can be many different things. And so what's recommended then is, when that appears, to shift from the sensations to that. But initially it won't be stable, it'll drop away, and then you go back to the breath. So you do this, but eventually it'll stabilise, and then you stay with that the rest of the way, because around that time, your sense faculty, due to your improved focus, your sense faculties start to slowly shut down. So you will need at some point to move from the tactile sensations to that. But that's something that happens spontaneously, and it happens at different stages depending on the person. For some people it's more early, some people later on those 9 stages. It's not like a fixed point.
But it's like with your eyes open.
Well, eyes open, eyes closed, it's the same. It's a mental image. It's not a visual. It's not visual. It's not a visual image.
It's when you're on the breath.
It's relating to the breath. It's relating to the air element.
So if you're on the awareness, it's not going to happen.
No, because you're already on a mental object. Yeah. No, it's only specifically for the breath. You're focusing on the breath, which is the air element, and by focusing on that, this is like a subtle it's called the quiet signa. It's a subtle expression of that as the mind becomes more focused and clear.
Well,